Hello. So I've been making my own dimensional lumber and slabbing live edge boards with the chainsaw mill for 6 years now. I've got some questions and comments on the channel with regards to the setup that I'm using. So I have a log that needs to be slabbed up today. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to talk a little bit about my equipment and my setup, and maybe provide some tips for folks that are just getting into slabbing lumber with a chainsaw mill. Okay, so let's start with the chainsaw. Now, I think a lot of people are under the impression that you need a large displacement saw to do any kind of chainsaw milling work. Now, I don't believe that's quite accurate, and I think there are more critical factors to consider beyond engine size. So instead of just providing a blanket statement like you need a 60cc saw or larger to do milling work, I want to provide some examples that I've had with several different chainsaws. And keep in mind that the type of logs that I'm sawing are usually fir or cedar logs, and they're usually between 12 and 18 inches in diameter and between about 6 feet and 12 feet in length. Now, when I first started out milling lumber, I was using a 46cc gas homeowner chainsaw, which only put out about 2.8 horsepower. Now, that chainsaw cut pretty slowly, and I'd have to let it cool off between cuts, but it did get the job done. I was able to slab quite a bit of lumber with that little chainsaw. I've also tried out this little 80-volt cordless chainsaw here. It's roughly equivalent to a 50cc gas saw of the homeowner variety, and it puts out around 3 to 3.3 horsepower. Again, this chainsaw cuts pretty slowly, but it will get the job done provided that you take your time with it. Now, while you can slab lumber with a low-end homeowner chainsaw, I don't generally recommend it because these entry-level homeowner chainsaws are really designed for light-duty work, and they're not really well suited for these long sustained rip cuts that put a lot of stress on the saw. So as I started to mill more lumber, I upgraded to this 50cc Stihl MS271 farm and ranch saw. It's designed for heavier use in mind, puts out 3.5 horsepower, and as a result, it doesn't struggle on the larger cuts like the homeowner saws did. Now, I felt that this chainsaw was pretty well matched to the kind of work I was doing, but after some time, I came across a really great deal on this 50cc Stihl MS261 professional saw, and I just couldn't pass it up. Now, as a professional saw, it has additional durability features built in, and it puts out 4 horsepower, which is equivalent or better to most 60cc chainsaws. This is a very lightweight chainsaw. It's more fuel efficient, it's easier to start, and results in less user fatigue than a larger chainsaw. So if I were to recommend a chainsaw for the size and types of logs that I usually mill, I would suggest that a farm and ranch saw or a professional saw that puts out 3.5 horsepower or more should work really nicely. Now, one of the biggest issues you may encounter has to do with the chainsaw bar, especially if you're planning to use a homeowner type chainsaw for any kind of slabbing work. And that's because heavy duty bars are rarely available for light duty chainsaws, which are usually paired with lightweight laminated bars. Now, when you add a chainsaw mill to the bar, it has to be clamped down with a lot of force to make sure that it doesn't slip around and make contact with the chain. So that attachment force, along with the added weight of the chainsaw mill and the added heat from long rip cuts, almost always results in a lightweight bar getting either pinched or warped after just a few uses. That's going to cause your chainsaw to work a lot harder and could even burn out your saw. So if you're planning to cut any more than just a few boards without replacing your bar, I really recommend choosing a chainsaw for which a heavy-duty bar is available. For example, this Oregon Power Cut bar, this is made with a solid piece of steel. There are no rivets back here where the chainsaw mill attaches, and this bar is a lot less likely to get pinched or warped. Now, these bars that come with the Stihl Pro and Farm and Ranch series, these are actually laminated bars, but they seem to be very heavy-duty laminated bars, and I imagine you could probably get a fair amount of use with these in slabbing work, but I still think that the solid bar is the best way to go. Now, as far as the chain goes, you can't actually use just a standard cross-cutting chain for rip cutting, but the rip cutting chains use a smaller grind angle on the cutters, and that produces a smoother cut and less effort from the chainsaw. So today I'm going to be using a rip cutting chain from Archer. These work out really well, and they're really not more expensive than a standard chain. I've also used rip cutting chains from Granberg, and those also work really well. They are more expensive, but I think they're also more durable. Now, regardless of what chain you end up using, you're probably going to find that rip cuts will dull out your chain pretty quickly, and you're going to have to sharpen the chain more frequently. There are several different types of chainsaw attachments for milling lumber on the market. I have just a couple of examples here. Now on this side I have the beam machine. It makes creating beams really easy with a chainsaw and a 2x4 or a 2x6 to help guide it along. It's a simple design, it's lightweight, inexpensive, and pretty effective, but in my opinion it's really only good for making rough cut beams. Over here is the Granberg Alaskan Mill G777. It's designed for up to 18-inch logs. Now this is also pretty easy to use, and it can make really nice beams or boards with reasonable accuracy. And just like most mills on the market, these are pretty easy to use. They just attach to the chainsaw bar with a couple of bolts. Now let's go outside and check out the log setup. Okay, so what I have here is a Douglas fir tree. It's about 8.5 feet long and about 14 inches wide. Now, just for stability, I've cut off the end of the tree. Actually, this used to be the tree stump here, and I've slabbed two sides of it just to make it flat on both sides. And then the slabs here I've put on the side of the log just to keep it from rolling. Now, right now it's not a problem, but once I get most of this log cut away, it's going to lighten up the load a bit, and that'll have a tendency to slide whenever I'm cutting the log. So to prevent that, I've put an L bracket here just for some added stability to keep it from sliding. So now the log can't slide this way and it can't rock either way, so it's pretty solid and it's not going to be moving around when I'm trying to cut it. Now with the Alaska mill, you need a nice flat surface to perform your first cut. Now after the first cut, you just use the top of the log for subsequent cuts, but that first cut needs to be nice and flat. So you can't actually use a 2x6 or a 2x8 just screwed or bolted here to the top of the log. But I found that using a piece of wood for your first cut doesn't always turn out really great. The wood has a tendency to get twisted or warped, and that can transfer those issues into your boards that you're trying to cut. So I like to use steel. Steel doesn't warp or twist like wood does. And these are just framing channels. They're 10-foot long steel framing channels I bought from the Home Depot for about $29 each. So this was a pretty inexpensive setup here. So what I found is as long as I keep the length of these to 10 feet or less, I don't get any sag in the middle. So these work out pretty well just using a couple of cross beams on either side of the log. Now to make sure that the sawmill goes in nice and straight and comes off straight off of the log, I like to make sure that my beams are a little bit longer than the log I'm cutting. So this is an 8.5-foot log and my beams are 10 feet. So that gives me a little ramp here to make sure that the mill slides on straight and comes off straight as well. Now the cross beams here, there's nothing special. These are actually just scrap pieces of wood that I had laying around, and they're actually working out pretty well. I just have them secured with a few deck screws here and then a few eye bolts here on the side to secure the struts to the cross beam. And now to make sure that everything is parallel and in the same plane, I made sure that the cross beam on this end and on the other end of the log are nice and level. Now, if you want to cut at an angle, for example, if you have a log that's a lot bigger on one end and you want to follow the contour of the log, you can actually put these cross beams on top of the log, or at least one of them to raise it up. And you can then put additional blocks of wood underneath it to get even greater height. But I'm just cutting straight across this log today, so I just have a cross beam on each end of the log. Okay, so I'm just about ready to start cutting. Now what I've done is I've measured from the top of this strut down to the bottom of the cross beam. There's actually a little nut here that you probably can't see, but that measurement there is 3.75 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and give myself another 1/4 inch of margin, and I want to set my Alaska mill to cut my first cut at 4 inches. So the chainsaw bar will go just underneath the beam here at 4 inches. Okay, so let's see how that first cut turned out. I think it turned out really nicely. This is a really nice and smooth cut here. I don't see any major dips. Not until we get right up to the end there. There's a bit of a transition. But anyway, that's really minor. I could actually sand that out if I wanted to. Otherwise, this first cut turned out really nicely. Okay, so that first cut I cut at 4 inches. So the distance between the bottom of the Alaska mill and my chainsaw bar was 4 inches. So for the subsequent cuts, I'm going to be cutting 1-inch boards. So I need to adjust this down from 4 to 1 inches. That's a real simple process. There's just 2 nuts here. It uses a 1/2 inch wrench or even a scrunch tool. And you just loosen these up. Drop it down to 1 inch. And then tighten it back up. And now this will just sit directly onto the flat part that we just made on the log, and the rest of the boards will be cut at 1 inch deep. Now just after I started my initial cut there, I paused to put a couple of these tree felling wedges in place. Now there are a couple of reasons I do that. First of all, if the top of the log droops down, then that's going to change the angle of those struts. And also as the top of the log droops down, it also puts more drag on my chainsaw bar, and that's also not a good thing. So I used a couple of these on the end, and I have a few more in my pocket because sometimes as you get down the log, you start to feel some binding, and you can relieve that binding with additional wedges. But in this case, 2 were enough. So we'll go ahead and start another board and see how it goes. There's a lot of sap right about here, but otherwise this board looks pretty much like the first one I cut. Nice and smooth and really no problems at all. So at this point, the slabs that I put here to keep the log from rolling are now interfering with my Alaskan mill. So I had to take those off. I'm just using these little wedges here on the side to hopefully prevent it from rolling on this side. And once I get to the other side, I'll just have to take those slabs off. Also at this point, I think my chain is pretty dull. I really should stop and sharpen it, but it's getting dark, and if I do that, I won't be able to film this last piece here. So I want to go ahead and just muscle through it, or at least that's the plan. Okay, well that's definitely the last board I'll be able to cut tonight. I've pretty much run out of log. So they all turned out really good. I'm really happy with the results. Okay, so I have my log slabbed up, and I have 6 boards here, plus the top of the log. Now the bottom of the log was pretty thin and wasn't really useful for anything, so I'm just going to cut it up and use it for firewood. Now I'm going to be preparing these to dry next, which means I need to remove the bark. Now, you can actually leave the bark on, and some people do that while drying, but I recommend removing the bark because it reduces the chances that bugs will get into the wood. In fact, these boards here have just been sitting overnight, and there are already several spots that I can see in the wood where bugs have bored into the bark. Now, you can also peel the log before you slab it, and that's probably advisable because any dirt or grit that gets into the bark will facilitate dulling out your chainsaw chain faster. But in my case, this bark was so thick and difficult to remove, I decided just to slab it first, and that'll make it easier to get a tool in between the wood and the bark and remove it that way. Now, there are different tools you can use to remove bark from a log. One actually attaches to the chainsaw and will remove the bark rather quickly, but it also tears up the wood, and so I really like to use just hand tools. So what I have here is a bark spud. This is made by a company called Oschenkopf. It's made in Germany. I believe Oschenkopf means ox head. Now, it wasn't very expensive, but it's a high quality tool. Now, I just bought the head alone, and I made my own handle just from a broken shovel. And I also have here a draw knife. This is also useful for removing bark. This is also made by the same company, and again was not that expensive, but it's a high quality tool made in Germany. Now, the difference here is that the bark spud will allow you to get between the bark and the wood, and you can kind of peel off the bark, whereas of course the draw knife, it actually cuts off the bark, and when you're cutting off the bark, you tend to cut into the wood, and so you'll make marks into the wood. Whereas the bark spud, if you're able to get underneath the bark and peel it, you have a really nice surface. And you can see I've peeled this with the bark spud, and it's nice and smooth with no cut marks. So I like to use the bark spud when I can, but it just all depends on the condition of the bark and also what season you cut the tree in. If you cut it in spring, for example, you have a lot of wet sap on the wood, and that usually helps to get the bark off a little easier, whereas in the summer or in the winter time, sometimes that bark is sort of cemented onto the wood, and the only way to get it off really is to cut it off. So anyway, I'm going to be mostly using this bark spud. I also have a more knife here, which I may use to cut off some of the bark. So let me go ahead and get started, and we'll see how it goes. So as you can see here from the dust, we already have bugs burrowing into the bark there. And here is another one here, and another one here. So it doesn't take long for the bugs to start burrowing in, and that's why I remove the bark when I dry the wood. Here's a close-up view of the top of the log here that I peeled with the bark spud, and you see it's pretty nice and smooth. There are a few little scratch marks here that I made with the bark spud, but this is nothing like what you would see if I were to peel the log with the draw knife. There'd be lots of cuts. And there's not really one way that's better than the other. It just depends on how you want the wood to look and how much effort you're willing to put into it. So here's one of the bugs that right there, still alive. It really seems that the Mora knife is the best tool for this job. It's just easier to get under the bark. I have to cut the end anyway before I can use the bark spud there, so just keeping the same knife in my hand seems to help facilitate getting this bark off a little easier. Okay, so next I'm going to be sealing up the ends of each board. Now you want to do this as soon as possible after the boards have been slabbed, and the reason is you want to slow down the drying process here on the ends where checking and cracking are most likely to occur. Now you can use any kind of sealant for this or even paint, but today I'm going to be using this. This is just shellac, and I'm going to be using 2 coats on each end. Okay, so I'm here in my carport, and this is where I'm going to be air drying my lumber. Now it's got a nice cover, and there's plenty of airflow here, so this is a really good place to air dry wood. Now I just have them sitting on some cinder blocks here, and I've leveled out each block to make sure that the boards sit nice and flat onto the cinder block. Now as you can see, the boards are also spread out. They're not just sitting flat on top of each other. And I have these little wood stickers here. This just happens to be some leftover lumber I had. This is a 3/4 inch plywood. Now it's usually recommended to use 1 inch stickers, but this will work just as well. I've used it before. Now I also have here on the ends some nylon straps. Now that's to help to prevent the boards from warping on the ends. I've seen that happen before, and if you just use some string or twine, that works as well. But these straps are really easy to adjust, and they're also extendable. So when I end up adding some more boards to this stack here, I'll be able just to grab another strap and add it to this one as well. Now it's generally recommended to air dry your lumber about 1 year for each inch of thickness of the boards. So these boards are 1 inch thick, so they should be dried in about a year. Now that's just a rule of thumb, of course. There are a lot of factors that go into the actual drying time. So a better way of doing it is to get one of these little moisture testers here. I got this off Amazon. It's not very expensive. And basically you just probe the wood after you have it set up for the right type of wood that you want to measure. And it'll actually give you a moisture content. Now it's usually recommended that you wait until your moisture content is down to about 12% before you use the lumber in any projects. So that's about all I have for today, and we'll see you next time.